Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CDS presentation on GDPR. I'm John Hawley, also known as JD, the Chief Technology Officer here at CDS. And with me is Elliot Glist. Elliot's a product manager here at CDS, former web development manager.
Hello, everyone.
Our presentation today will take probably about a half an hour. Elliot's gonna do a little housekeeping to kick us off, and then we'll get right to it.
I think, as you guys probably know, you're on listen-only mode, so we're not going to be able to take questions from the audio. So there's a question panel on the control panel on your right side of your screen, most likely the right side of your screen. If you place some questions in the question panel, we'll be able to see your questions, and I'm pretty sure that the questions are only visible to JD and to you, JD and I and you. So please put your questions in there, and at about the midway point in the presentation, we'll take a few minutes to answer some of those questions, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll do that again. Any questions that we haven't gotten to, we'll do some follow-up post-webinar.
Yeah, it's unlikely we're going to be able to get to everyone's questions. This is a pretty hot topic, but we will absolutely follow up with everybody individually after the presentation over the next few days. Is there anything else?
That was it.
All right, without further ado, let's start the presentation. So I apologize if some of this is rudimentary for you folks. I know that a lot of you have been looking into GDPR for a while now, so consider this a little bit of a high-level review. What is GDPR? So the European Union General Data Protection Regulation is the EU's legislation designed to protect EU citizens, their data and privacy, and specifically also protect them from data breaches. The GDPR aims primarily to give control of personal data to the citizens who own that data, to whom that data applies. The legislation affects the use, storage of attendee, exhibitor, and event audience data for all event participants who are EU citizens, so citizens of those 28 EU countries. The legislation, GDPR was actually adopted 2 years ago, and it's become a hot topic because it's only going to be enforceable by the EU as of May 25th. Now, how are we preparing for GDPR compliance on your behalf? First thing we're doing is we're auditing and mapping data flows for personally identifiable information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what personally identifiable information, or PII, means, because it's a term you're going to hear over and over again. We've developed a specific data privacy policy for EU registrants, and a link to that policy is in the frequently asked questions that we sent out in the invite to this broadcast. So those of you who receive that invite, you should have a link to our FAQ, and then you can click that link, and inside that you'll see another link to our data privacy policy. And we're asking that all of you take a look at, all of our customers, take a look at this data privacy policy. I'm not going to go over it in detail on this broadcast, but this is really the core of what we're trying to tell our EU registrants and what we are asking them to agree to. So in a nutshell, the first part of the privacy policy discusses, at a high level, it confirms that CDS is following GDPR to ensure that all data is fairly and lawfully processed, obtained and used for clearly stated purposes, that we're not storing more data than we need, like Facebook, but I won't say that, that it's accurate and up to date, we don't keep it any longer than we need to, like Facebook, say that, and processed in accordance with your rights, that we keep your data secure and we don't transfer it to other countries without adequate protection. We also define what personally identifiable information means here, or PII. That's basically all information that can identify a registrant as an individual. So that can be anything from a first name, last name, email address, physical address, phone number, driver's license number, which we don't collect typically, passport number, et cetera, et cetera. So anything any data that can tie back to a particular individual is considered personally identifiable information. We are very clear about the type of data that we collect and then what we use it for. So you'll see here that everything that we use PII for is articulated here, including email marketing, email confirmations, looking up and printing a physical badge, lead retrieval activities, and then also down here is a list of the types of third parties that we may share personally identifiable information with. This section is on their rights, and all of these rights come straight out of the regulations. This talks about security measures that we take, and then the rights of access. And this part here is important. There's an email address here that should someone wish to view all of their data or perhaps to have us erase their data, here's where they go to do that. So that's the data privacy policy. Please review it in detail when you can. We're also reviewing agreements with third parties and having conversations with third parties to ensure GDPR compliance up and down the food chain starting with you, the member organization, and then extending to other third parties that you do business with, like housing vendors, exhibitor vendors, etc. This is probably the most extensive thing we're going to talk about today, implementing an opt-in process to ensure that EU registrants have explicitly consented to the way we use their data. Enabling their right to access their data that we store, allowing the right to be forgotten. We'll talk more about that later. Confirming the data breach notification policies. Those are the notification policies that should we suffer a data breach and lose personally identifiable information to a hacker, that we have notification policies in place to you and to them, and that we have identified data protection officers. That's already in place as well.
So this next one I think is mine, JD.
Okay.
Yeah. Which CDS products will be affected? As you can well imagine, every CDS product that we have that collects personally identifying information is impacted by the regulations. So that basically means registration pages, inquiry pages, our eReg system, our Express admin, also known as the back end, attendee lists, and exhibitor emails. These are all impacted by GDPR. So when will our registration pages and our other products be GDPR compliant? We're on target to be compliant prior to or on May 25th.
Which is when we have to be.
Exactly. So as an example, how are CDS registration pages changing to comply with the new GDPR regulations? When a registrant selects an EU country from the country drop-down list on the registration form, a new form field will appear. It's a conditionally exposed form field. It functions very similarly to what you may be familiar with when we made changes for the Canadian anti-spam law. So someone from an EU country will see this exposed on the registration form. It's basically a drop-down list that says, in accordance with GDPR, please review our data policy, our data privacy policy, and acknowledge that you agree to the use and storage of your personal data for purposes of attending this event. I know that JD just showed you the privacy policy really quickly, and again, we recommend that you take a look at it. that's CDS's GDPR privacy policy. It's written in as simple to understand language as you can have. And that's by design and also by requirement for the GDPR. The GDPR says that we have to provide information to people we are using their personal information in the simplest way that we can. So while our privacy policy has been vetted by our attorney, you won't see a lot of heavy legalese in that document. And that's a pattern that I imagine most of you are following or will follow as you revise your privacy policies. Okay, that was a tangent. So this is the form field that's exposed to people who say that they are from an EU country, and it basically has two options in it. I have read and agree, or I do not agree. So of course the question comes up, what happens if a registrant says, I do not agree? Basically, we stop registration at that point. At this point in the process, we, without agreement, are not allowed to store the registrant's data in our system. So at this point, we have to stop registration. We then indicate to the registrant that registration can't be completed without an opt-in, without GDPR opt-in. And this will come up as a message on screen to the registrant. We also present them with contact information to speak to either your representative or someone from our contact center. And that one's yours.
I do want to just back up a slide and remind everybody, we did a data analysis of all of our data for 2017, and this affects 5.2% of all registrations at CDS. And we did about 1.6 million registrations last year. So we've talked to at least one of our other major clients and found that correlated roughly with their event as well, which was an internationally attended event, but it affected roughly 5% of their registrants as well. So this is the scope of what we're dealing with. So we're not looking for everybody to see this opt-in or to require that everybody select or opt in. We're just dealing with GDPR affected registrants or EU residents. There's some great questions coming in, by the way. We are going to have this intermission. We're seeing that a lot of the questions coming in are questions that will be answered farther along in the presentation. So if we don't get to your questions in the intermission, it's likely because we expect them to be answered after the intermission. So what if a registrant wants to attend an event, but they don't want the marketing? Because what Elliot just presented to you was a full-on opt-in. So they see that entire data privacy policy, and they see that they have to opt into being marketed to, as well as us storing their information for the purposes of printing the badge and sharing their information with exhibitors, et cetera, et cetera. But in some cases, they want to go, but they don't want to get the emails. They still have to agree to the overall privacy policy, but at your discretion, we show additional marketing opt-out options after that. So some of you already do this, not specifically for EU registrants, but for all registrants, that allow them to opt out of receiving marketing materials, just get the badge and go to the show. So that option will still be available. This has been a hot topic internally and outside of CDS. How will group registration change? Because if GDPR requires an explicit opt-in by an individual to use their data, then how can somebody register on behalf of somebody else? So we've done a lot of thinking about this one, and here's how we're going to deal with it. It affects 3 of our main product areas. It's group attendee registration, exhibitor registration, where the MM will register a lot of additional exhibitors, and then add another, which a lot of you implement on your pages as well. So we're going to present the primary registrant with a modified opt-in that said, I have read and I agree, or I agree on the registrant's behalf. We don't feel that that quite does it, so we're going to send an opt-in email in addition to the standard email confirmation that the registrant gets. They'll get an opt-in email that says something on the order of, you have been registered for XYZ event. As an EU resident, you must agree to the use of your data for the event. And then the email will have a link to our privacy policy and a button that asks them to opt in. I have read and agree. Please confirm my registration. What happens if they don't opt in? What happens if they either don't read the email or they don't click the button? We're going to have an opt-in field in all of the registration records, and that opt-in field will contain a pending status so that we can report and follow up on those individuals if you guys want that to happen, or you can do that as well. So there will be a report made available in Express Reports for all the people who have not explicitly opted in.
And that'll be a standard report. We're just going to add that to the standard reports that are in Express Reports.
Okay.
All right.
Now we're on to intermission. So we'll take a few questions here. What is your backup plan if you're unable to be fully compliant by May 25th? We're going to be fully compliant by May 25th. So we've actually been in talks with an EU attorney, and I'm sure a lot of you folks have been as well, who have said that, that May 25th is the date at which these regulations can be enforced. It does not necessarily mean that the police show up at your door on May 25th. They had to put in a cutoff date. That's the cutoff date. The EU attorney we spoke to said, we don't expect the world to crack open on May 25th. It's just the date at which the enforcement activity starts. However, we expect to be fully compliant by May 25th. Elliot here has put together a terrific project plan for all of our products and those products that we showed you in a previous slide to ensure that they are compliant with the regulations by then.
We've got another good question. Not everyone living in the EU is an EU citizen, or EU citizens live outside the EU. How does this drop-down capture those folk? Well, we basically can only act on the information that we have. So if someone puts their address as an EU address, we are going to assume that they are an EU resident. If someone is, let's say you're a student attending a medical conference and you're a student at the University of California, Santa Cruz, but you're actually a resident of Germany. If you put down the University of California, Santa Cruz as your address, there's no way for that form to know that you are an EU resident. So we can only act on the data that we have.
Yeah, the only other way to do it would be to ask every single registrant, are you a resident of the European Union? We discussed that as an option and decided that that would be excessive. That we're talking, since we're only talking about 5% of overall registrants, to ask the minority whether they happen to have this particular regulation apply to them wouldn't be necessary. And we ran that by our attorneys as well, and they seemed fine with that. Another good question here. Well, wait a minute. You mentioned research numbers. Could you repeat them, as it gives our staff scale as to how your research has been verified? So we did in 2017, and correct me if I'm wrong, Elliot, 1.6 million registrations. And of those 1.6 million, we identified a little over 5% as coming from one of those 28 EU countries.
We pulled that data through the DataSense.
Through DataSense, right? DataSense, most of you know, is our analytics tool, which does year-over-year reporting. It's consolidated reporting of all events that CDS does. See what else we have here. Can you go ahead and implement the opt-in? This is a good question for all users rather than just those in EU countries. We discussed that possibility, and a lot of folks, we went to an IAEE seminar as well that discussed that possibility of, hey, why don't we just go all the way and ask and give everybody this opt-in option. And it is an option, but we are really acting on our customers' behalf, which is you guys. We're acting on your behalf, and we have both heard from and intuited that most of our customers do not want to give any more opt-out options than they absolutely have to their potential registrants, because it's more contacts with the registrant than seems necessary, and B, you're giving them more of an opportunity either not to be marketed to or not to go to the show. So if at the point these regulations percolate over to the US, and there's a lot of talk about that happening at some point in the future, we'll certainly be doing that. Another one you want to take here, Elliot?
All right, I'm just looking here. Sorry, we're just reading. Some of the questions are.
Yeah, some of these we're actually going to answer in the subsequent slides, like how does your data privacy policy work in association with the member association's privacy policy? So we'll be talking about that. Let's see. Is this archived for others to review later? Yes. We are recording this session, so the webinar will be available for, we're going to send out a link to the recording so you can pass that along to others in your organization who might have missed it. Okay.
We're going to be talking about
lead retrieval.
Lead retrieval and exhibitors scanning badges and how that relates to consent shortly. So we've got a good.
Let's scroll down to another one here. Let's see. That one's too hard, Steve. I'm sorry. But we will definitely be answering all of these questions one way or another. So, all right. Okay. A number of these are going to be answered in the remainder of the presentation. So I think what we'll do is we'll go through, we'll finish the presentation, and then we're going to have an additional open question forum and get to some of these others. And then anything we don't have time to get to, we will be following up with you because we'll be able to save the questions as well. All right.
All right.
So to continue, and this answers one of the questions. As a CDS client, can I determine what language is in the data privacy policy that we're asking EU residents to opt into? So in addition to our policy that I showed you, we can provide a link to your data privacy policy, but in order to comply with GDPR, our policy has to be standard for everyone. So we won't be accepting modifications to our policy unless they would apply to all of you. But again, we'll be able to provide a link to your policy as well, like we do for many of you already. We have links to your privacy policies on our registration website. So, great. Next one is, how about lead retrieval? Also a question that's been asked. So the act of presenting a badge to an exhibitor, it's almost the same as handing a business card to an exhibitor. You understand what you're doing, and our data privacy policy indicates that they're agreeing that to share their data via badge scanning, but it constitutes explicit consent to be contacted by that exhibitor or to be marketed to. So we don't see the lead retrieval side of the business being dramatically affected in that way.
So how are the other exhibitor services products,
like the marketing products,
impacted? There will be a slight change with our marketing products, our exhibitor services products. When using exhibitor emails or the attendee list marketing products, exhibitors will have to confirm that they comply with the GDPR regulations. It's simply, we're going to present when logging in the opportunity to say, yes, I am going to comply with GDPR regulations, and the exhibitor will have a checkbox to select and confirm that they are intending to comply. It's just something that we wanted to note, that unless you guys request otherwise, CDS does not share registrant information directly with exhibitors through these products. The products can be used to contact registrants, but no data is shared through them. I hope that makes sense. That may raise some questions. Let's see. The next couple of questions, I think, have to do with the data itself. And what happens when someone asks to see their data or to be forgotten? With what we've all been witnessing with Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of the House and Senate over the past couple days, I imagine that many Facebook users have downloaded their data from Facebook. The GDPR regulations ask that data processors and data controllers provide an avenue and a process for any registrant, in our case, to be able to see the personally identifiable information that we have on them. So our data privacy policy, and I think JD showed you this when he quickly glanced through that policy, at the very bottom, the policy provides an email address where someone can make the request to view, update, or delete their personal information from the CDS system. So a registrant emails us, asks us to handle the request. If the request is to give them the data that we have, we will do that. If the registrant sees the data and says, you know, I really don't want to have that in your system, I'd like to be forgotten, then we make the record for that registrant anonymous, in that we mask the personally identifiable information: first name, last name, email address, company, telephone numbers, that type of stuff. We will leave some of the data intact. We will be leaving the country, for instance, intact.
Right, we were intending on leaving the demographic information intact, and then we had, because it's statistically relevant, we had a conversation with our attorneys, and they basically said if anything that could be tied back to an individual, and if you have demographic information along with a country, et cetera, it's possible that it could. That should be anonymized as well. So we will be anonymizing demographic information. Remember this. We're talking 5% of overall registrants, and the amount that are actually going to ask to be forgotten, we expect to be tiny, tiny, tiny. This is a statistically insignificant portion of the registration population.
And then the last part of this process is that anyone who makes that request of us to either share their, enable them to see their data, or to be removed from our system, or to be forgotten, we will alert you of that request, and we'll also alert any third parties that we've shared that information with. Now, if the registrant has not yet attended the event and they ask to be forgotten, we will make an effort to explain to them that we can fulfill the request to be forgotten after the event takes place. We need their personal information for their badge. We need for safety purposes on site. There are many reasons why we can't delete a person's information prior to attending the event. And again, we suspect that this would be a request made by a really small number of people. If a registrant, of course, if a registrant is persistent and says, no, I really want to be, I want to attend the event, but I want my data to be anonymized or I want to be forgotten prior to the event, then we will refer them to you prior to deleting anything in our system.
All right, very good. Getting some more good questions coming in.
And then what's the next one we got?
Okay. All right. Is that me or you? That's you.
As a CDS client, I ask CDS to market to prospects on my behalf, sending email blasts. By sending email blasts, is that compliant? Yes, as long as the data that we receive from you, whether it's data that's merged into our system, or data that we're getting from third parties and emailing on your behalf, that data has to be vetted. That data has to be compliant with GDPR. So any EU residents in that data set that we receive have to have opted in prior to us getting that that file and that data set. So with that in mind, we do recommend that all EU residents be contacted by you or member organizations, or by us on your behalf, before marketing to them.
That's a big ask. So we want to pause there. We went round and round on this. What about everybody that we are currently marketing to? What about the members that are already in your membership database who are EU residents? You have to reach out to them to get their consent somehow. So you can either, if you don't receive it during the registration process and you're marketing to them heavily before the registration process, we are recommending that you reach out to them beforehand and get that opt-in. So
great.
How does GDPR affect your agreements with us? So GDPR indicates that we are all jointly responsible for ensuring adherence to the regulations. So as the data flows up and down the chain, together we're responsible for ensuring the privacy and protection of that data. We don't plan on modifying our existing contracts or making any of you, our customers, contractually liable for that, because we are actually processing data on your behalf. What we do intend on doing is sending a notice to all of you that we're relying on assurances of compliance from you, just as you are relying on assurances of compliance from us. And on advice from our attorneys, we feel that that's sufficient to ensure that we are jointly responsible. As a client, what do we recommend to you as best practice for handling your own data? We're not lawyers. We only play them in webinars. I don't hear any laughter. That was Elliot. Elliot wrote that. I'm sorry.
Yay! Somebody has. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We do recommend that if you have not already, and I suspect everybody on the phone already has, but that you seek your own legal advice to address the data that is in your possession. Figure that out. So you've already seen some advice from us as to how to handle registrants or members by contacting them proactively to get that opt-in, or having us do that for you. But any other measures that you need to take, you should bring that up with your attorney. So we've come to the end of our presentation here. We have a lot of really, really good questions here, and we're going to address some of them. And then some of them, by the way, are specific to the needs of your particular organization, so we want to follow up with you individually. So I'm going to go back to that question that I said was too hard before. Now that I understand it, in the case of a show having registrations pre and post May 25th, should the third-party opt-in be treated as the GDPR response for pre-May 25th registrations? Basically, if I read this correctly, the question is about if I've, in the past, collected what seems to be an opt-in. So basically, if they didn't opt out, and we gave a registrant the opportunity to opt out, and they didn't, so they've effectively opted in, would we see that as a GDPR opt-in? And the answer is no, because all of the prior checkboxes, typically when we do an opt-out on our registration sites or on our marketing materials or our marketing products, the opt-out is a pre-checked box that says, I agree to be marketed to, essentially. And GDPR explicitly states that that type of thing doesn't fly, that you can't have a pre-checked checkbox that the end user specifically has to opt in to whatever they're agreeing to. So we would not consider previous non-opt-outs as opt-ins. Sorry if that sounded complex. The answer to that one.
So there's one down there. Yep, that one.
This one here, yeah.
Go ahead.
Masking. How do we mask? Do we delete it?
Once again, there's a reason we will have to mask and not delete data, and that reason is that often the records are tied to payments. Oh
wait, I see what he's getting at. No, the questioner here, we'll call him Matt, is asking, well, do you just mask it visually, but you hang on to the data? No, we're actually cleaning out the data. So we are anonymizing the data in our database. We're just not deleting the record. So we won't know who that person is, but we'll still retain the record.
And that record will be tied to a payment, which will not have the name of who made the payment any longer. But for your records, for your revenue reports, you would still have that revenue in those reports. So that's one of the reasons why we can't just flat out delete and remove records from our system.
Right. Exactly. Let's see. All right. So one of you asked, would you be able to add a checkbox that simply says EU resident that can be selected if they're under the address? So that's a possibility. So on a case-by-case basis, we could change the opt-in language, for example. If you don't like the opt-in language that we've selected for your website, you can change that because it is your specific website. If you'd prefer that we use a checkbox that says EU resident, and then when they check that checkbox, they get the same message about the data privacy policy as they would by selecting the country of origin, we can. I don't see any reason we couldn't do that for them. Do you?
My concern is just that that a checkbox might be overlooked, and
no, they would still
so they would select the country.
They would select if, let's say, for example, they live in New York City, so they select New York City, but they could still click a checkbox that says EU resident, and then they would get the opt-in. Yeah, we could do that if desired.
I would imagine most forgotten requests come by the client. Who will we reach out to at CDS to submit requests on behalf of the customer? You will always have the opportunity to reach out to your registration manager and let them know, or you could follow the same process and email us at the data privacy dedicated email box. That email box will generate a ticket in our system and follow through a process within our system. So that may even be the best way to go. But your registration manager would be able to get that request to the appropriate people here at CDS.
Okay. What if my registration opens, and I'm assuming this means on-site? What if my registration opens prior to May 26th and someone from the EU registers before the new data privacy information is in place?
So I think that means any registration that is currently open at this moment, and the event could take place a month, 3 months from now. They're saying, I think this question is about
what do we do in the gap?
What do we do about those people who may be from the EU who have already registered but didn't have the opportunity to opt in?
So from our perspective, this applies to, at some point you have to do a cutover. From our perspective and our attorney's perspective, this applies to registrants after who come to us after May 25th or after we we implement the opt-in. So we do not intend on going back to all people who have registered for an event that has not yet taken place and asking for their explicit opt-in. Oh, this is a good question. Do we have to refund the fees if they choose to opt out? So it depends on when they choose. If they choose to not to opt in, they cannot register because if they're opting into having us store and use their data right then, which is why we put it on the contact info step. So that data never gets stored, they never get registered. If they choose to be forgotten or they wish to opt out at a later time, then we end up bumping that person back to you to make that decision as to how you want to handle that registration. We don't want to make that decision for you. We expect this to be a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of registrants, but yeah, it's going to happen. We want a conversation to happen so that we can explain, or you can explain to the potential registrant, hey, unless you opt in, you can't come to the show. If we want you to come to the show, if you don't want us to market to you, we can do that. If you want us to anonymize you or erase your data after the show, we can do that. But we need to store your data and to print your name on a badge for the purposes of coming to the show. So,
right. For CDS, we have to understand that the GDPR regulations they pertain to us as processors and controllers of your data. But so we can't, if a person doesn't opt in to the use of that data for the event, for the purposes of the event, then we don't have the rights to store it under the GDPR regulations. So another person has asked, is there such a thing as implied consent for people looking to purchase a ticket without having to put a hard stop on the registration if they don't opt in? And that's the problem that this regulation puts in front of us. You have to have explicit consent for the use of your data for this purpose.
Yeah, there's no such thing as implied consent under GDPR, unfortunately.
And it's also important to keep in mind that we're talking about the use of your data for this purpose. And GDPR and probably regulations that we'll see coming out in the future are an attempt to say, I give a person control and power over their data for a specific purpose. And we're saying, we agree with you, and here are the reasons that we need to use your data. This is what it's going to be used for, and we're very explicit about that. So yeah, there's no implied consent, and we have to get, from EU residents, we have to get consent to store the data in order to move along in the process.
Okay, another good question. It's my understanding that EU countries need to opt in, EU residents, and we need to be specific. Don't we also need to ask them to opt in for association membership, or for emails about additional products and services from the association? So basically, you were asking us whether you guys, the associations, need to go and get those opt-ins, not just for registration for your events, but for them to actually be marketed to on behalf of the association. And our recommendation is yes, you do that. You again, you take it up with your attorney, but we are recommending that you get the same type of explicit consent that we are looking for as well.
And many of you may already have additional opt-in questions on your registration form to begin with. Many of you don't, but this is an opportunity to look at that. And some of those opt-in questions will have absolutely nothing to do with GDPR, as JD just mentioned in that last question.
Leslie asks, how do you honor registrant information requests? In other words, a registrant would like to know about all the data that we store about them. So we have this wonderful tool called DataSense that is a consolidation of all of our data for 10 years or more into a data warehouse. So as most of you know from our own our own discussions with you, we've created this data warehouse that sucked in all the registration information over the years. So if somebody calls and says, I would like to be forgotten, or I want to see all the data you have on me, we're going to be using that tool. It's going to be a bit of a manual process at the moment because we don't expect to get a lot of these, but we will be querying data sets for all information on that particular registrant by whatever contact information we have for that registrant, and then we'll be emailing it to them, and then they can view it for accuracy or decide if they want us to retain it or not.
So we have another good question that I think it warrants it warrants asking an attorney, but the question is, we have defaulted to yes on our communication preferences in the past. Is that now illegal for Europe, for European countries, for EU countries? I think that that's a question that it makes sense to ask a lawyer, but my understanding of GDPR is that you cannot default to an opt-in. You cannot default affirmatively on the form for a GDPR-related question.
Yeah, you can't have a pre-checked checkbox.
Right.
So that doesn't. It's similar to the other question that we had of, hey, we pre-selected a checkbox a year or two ago that says it's okay to be marketed to. Is that going to cut it? And from our research, the answer is no, it is not.
Great.
So what else we have here?
How do you honor the data portability provisions under GDPR? Export everything about the customer into a machine-readable format? Yes. We're still building that process out, but we're planning to have this data in, if the technical term is a JSON format, but yes, it's machine and human readable format for people.
All right.
One of the while JD's picking the next question here, one of the things that I think people will be surprised by if they were to see what data we have on them is that we really don't have anything other than we capture in the registration process. So unlike companies like Facebook, where there's data culled from multiple sources into their system, when you ask to see your Facebook data, you can often be very surprised by the amount of data that you have, that they have. So it will be readable for people, and it won't be a lot of data.
Okay, here's a good question. Do you collect data on behalf of the controller, meaning on your behalf, and sell it, i.e. list rental, to the exhibitors? And if so, how do you collect those granular opt-ins? So exhibitor emails and attendee lists are examples of products where we take registrant information and we allow exhibitors to market to those registrants. So we're going to have something, I think we mentioned this in the presentation, but something like an end user license agreement where the exhibitor explicitly says, I am following GDPR compliant procedures before I market to this particular list of individuals. Does CDS sell lists without your consent? We do not sell lists without our customers' consent. We do that on your behalf. And then we've already kind of discussed how to deal with the whole idea of scanning and sharing leads on an individual basis. So, okay. I think we have covered the vast majority of the questions that apply to a broad audience. So let's see if there's any more in here.
So there is a good question. One of the last questions here. If asked to remove data, you would remove the individual data after info is imported to clients first, with the note that the data is to be removed. If if we've given you an export of the data and you have it in your system, or we've given you updated data on a particular person that has asked to be removed from our system, we would convey that ask to you.
Right. And we would expect the same in reverse. So if somebody has contacted you and asked to be forgotten, you would be responsible for contacting us, at which point we would anonymize them in our systems, as well as any other third parties you do business with, like, you know, your housing vendors, et cetera. You would contact them and say, this registrant has asked to be forgotten. And if we get that request, and this actually goes to another question that was asked earlier, we don't know who's going to receive the request to be forgotten. So it could be us, it could be you, depending on when and where the registrant makes that decision. But either way, we have to notify each other and anonymize or delete the data. So at this point, I think what we're going to do is close the conference, the webinar, and we do have a few additional questions that pertain to your specific events that we're gonna follow up with you individually on. And we just want to thank everybody for participating. There's a ton of interest in this topic. We hope you found the webinar informative and not too dull. Anyway, I don't speak for myself, Elliot, but not
it was very exciting.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and we will be in touch on these follow-up questions as well, and any other questions you may have. You'll see our contact information here on the website. Feel free to contact us directly with those email addresses, or you can go through your registration manager, you can go through your account executive, or any way you want to get in touch with us, and we'll get your questions answered, and we will all get through this next 6 weeks.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions.
Bye-bye.